To start out, you know, if you want to answer these questions, or you want to answer any question about technology, where do you go? I can tell you where I go. I go to my millennial daughter. So we bring you a panel of millennials to answer our questions. Let me begin just kind of by segueing from Terry and William's remarks. I mean, if we look at the maps that William presented, it's kind of a stark visual of the important issues facing the city of Los Angeles. By city, I mean the greater Los Angeles community or the metropolitan area. And the question is, you know, what is this city going to look like as the information economy, the technological economy, replaces the manufacturing economy that was so long the characteristic of this city? And if you recall the comparison with other tech-centric cities, the distribution of income becomes very skewed. And it's headed that way in Los Angeles, but it's very much not that way yet, because we still have a large manufacturing sector, a large healthcare sector, large trade sector, but of course those things are changing. And we know that these changes cause stress and frustration, but kind of also pain. I mean, witness in San Francisco the protests against Google buses, people, you know, hitting the buses, or the protests about gentrification south of Market, or in Seattle the head tax on Amazon, which was kind of so ill-advised that it was immediately repealed, right? But that head tax was Amazon, look at what's happening to our city, and we want to at least say we want to punish you, even if we don't. Or even Austin. So Austin's got a new ordinance which is called a right of return for East Austin. No one knows what that means. No one knows how to implement it. But it is a kind of a reaction in these cities that William showed us. And so the question that we want to delve into in different ways with our panelists here is LA headed for the same thing? You know, we see some of these same reactions here. You know, we see coffee shops in Boyle Heights getting not so pleasant graffiti in front as just kind of, you know, one of those reactions. But there, you know, of course, as Terry pointed out, many positive aspects to this tech revolution. And there's some, you know, they come along with increasing inequality. And so the question we want to explore is, you know, are there things that we might learn from other cities' experiences and from some of the changes that are already happening in LA that'll help guide the tech community, universities and colleges here in LA, philanthropic and civic institutions, and importantly, local government in guiding this transformation in a way that's more inclusive and is not leaving out people the way it did in Seattle and San Francisco and Austin and others. And so what we've done, you know, with the help of, actually we've solicited the help of the Annenberg Foundation. I spoke to that in my opening remarks, Annenberg Tech and what has been happening there to help assemble this panel of millennials, to help us understand what is going on and what do we learn from what's going on, and what can we take away and think about in terms of how we might guide this really inevitable transformation from a manufacturing economy to an information economy. So what I want to do here with the panel is go around to each one of you and start us off with a question for you, but you can also tell us, you know, something about what you're doing and how you come at this. So we'll get to know you, and then we'll have some more general questions. And so Ev Boyle is up first. Ev is the executive director of LA Tech Org, a nonprofit coalition of the Los Angeles area tech companies and community organizations working together to expand economic opportunity in underserved communities and help tackle the city's most pressing problems. He was principal investigator of a report called Empowering the Public Through Open Data. And I think we want to get back to that data issue because it's not just feel good. We need to have metrics that policymakers can work with if we're going to guide the city. Ev holds a Master of Science and a Master of Arts in Global Media and Communications from London School of Economics and from University of Southern California, and a bachelor's degree in communications from the University of Pennsylvania. And so let me start and stop talking and let you all start talking. So your latest work has been on the connection between nonprofits and civic institutions and somewhat government and the tech community. And while LA is a very large city, it's a city of 88 political entities. And when we saw in William's presentation, the tech sector is spread over many cities in the county, and many cities in the county are being left out or they're kind of being bifurcated, which is an issue, I think, in El Segundo. And how does this fragmentation affect the way in which you approach the intersection between civic organizations, philanthropic organizations, and really trying to help the community be more involved in the benefits that are happening from the tech revolution?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really important question. First of all, just thank you for having me here. This is actually my first time at UCLA. I've lived in LA for 7 years. I worked at USC for about 6. I've never been on this campus. I know. I have one nice thing to say, which is it is beautiful. Like it's nicer. You guys have hills, trees. We don't have that at SC. So thank you.
So you'll have to come back many times.
So yeah, the question about fragmentation is really interesting. And you mentioned a report that we did over at SC on open data across the county. So we looked at all 88 cities and what cities were doing with data and which ones were kind of making it open and how and in what ways. And very few actually were at that time. So there's all this fragmentation. I drove here from Los Feliz. I passed through West Hollywood on the way. I passed through Beverly Hills on the way. These are their own cities. But now we're in, where are we, Westwood? Okay, so Westwood's part of LA, right? So there's a lot of different stuff going on here, and if you're a citizen, you might not even realize that you're passing through these different entities. And I think that comes with a lot of challenges. There's also opportunities. One of the challenges in William's presentation, I just did a quick sort of lookup of those cities that have the most tech investment, right? So a few of them are the biggest cities in LA, so that makes sense. It's in LA County. It's the city of LA, it's Long Beach. Those are the 2 biggest cities in the county. But then a lot of the other ones are really tiny. I mean, El Segundo has, I don't know, 13,000 people or something, but they have SpaceX. And if you look across the county, 7 of the 10 biggest cities in the county aren't on that list at all. So a big chunk of the population in the county isn't getting the benefit of this tech boom. So cities like Santa Clarita, Palmdale, even Pasadena, I don't think was on the list. So that's a challenge when you think about equity. It's also an opportunity in the sense that each one of these cities can kind of be their own little, they talk about states as the laboratories of democracy. These cities can be laboratories of innovation. So City of LA has done a lot of innovative stuff around data and programs related to actually tech and equity and getting folks in internships and things like that. West Hollywood's doing all kinds of stuff around transportation. When I was in Beverly Hills, I saw bhsaves.org. That's their initiative around saving water, where they're trying to do it a little differently. So I think there's some opportunities there, but it is a big challenge. The last thing I'll say on that is I think the city of LA and the county play a huge role in this. So they can really kind of set the agenda, and especially the county can do stuff that cuts across all the cities. So the county's budget is $31 billion a year. The city of LA's budget's about $10 billion a year. The next biggest budget in the whole county is Long Beach, which is $3 billion. So the county of LA's budget is massive. And if they really commit to working with businesses and civic institutions and folks like that to make this tech boom more equitable, I think there's a lot they can do. And I'll leave it there for now. But
great, thank you. And so now turning to Carmen. Carmen Palafox is partner Macon LA. Her focus at Macon LA is coaching entrepreneurs in finance and investment, managing fund operations, developing investor relations, was formerly vice president of Dimensional Fund Advisors, where she scaled operations into new markets, including Latin America, Canada, and Europe. She has a bachelor's degree in economics, also from USC. She's a board member of CCEO Youth Build and on the advisory board of Santa Monica City College's business department, and a contributing writer for Latinas in Business. So, Carmen, you have a kind of wide experience here in working with entrepreneurs across the city and indeed across the world in helping them, reach their goals, particularly in the tech industry. Maybe you can share with us how you advise people who come from different cultures, who have to kind of get those cultures in front of people from quite different cultures in order to obtain financing and in order to succeed, and sort of what are the challenges there in all of these diverse communities that we have in Los Angeles?
I'll share a little bit more about what we do. So we're a venture fund, and we invest in tangible goods. So we are trying to make manufacturing relevant here in the United States. I have two business partners. One of my business partners, his background is in contract manufacturing. So his father started Neotech, which is one of LA's largest private contract manufacturers. And he came into the business as a Gen 2 and said, how can I make my business relevant? So he started investing in startups in the hardware space. What does that mean for us? It's everything from the Internet of Things, wearables, robotics. We've invested in space rockets, immersive tech, so a company that's digitizing the sense of touch using ultrasound technology, high heels, batteries, solar, so all across the board. So for us, manufacturing is still important. We want to make sure that it remains relevant because obviously it has a big multiplier effect. My other business partner is a mechanical systems engineer, and you asked about making sure that diverse communities are involved in the coming boom. Nora May, my business partner, she actually co-founded a nonprofit called Latinas in STEM. Why? Because when she was in high school, Alex Padilla came to her high school and said, here's this whole career path in engineering. You can be that too. And she did it. She went to MIT, got 3 degrees, and that's where she started. So I came into the business because I saw a big opportunity to invest and create a venture fund that is focused on the manufacturing space in Los Angeles. What do we do to make sure that it's inclusive? In October, we're going to host a startup weekend for Latinx. Everyone's invited, but this is really to bring together technologists, developers, business people to think about how they can start a business.
Great, thank you. Our next panelist is Austin Clements, and he is principal of 10110 Ventures. Prior to joining 10110, Austin worked at Sony Pictures licensing film and TV content to emerging video platforms. He's also on the board of advisors of Build LA, has an MBA from NYU, my daughter's university, but from NYU Stern, with a specialization in media, entertainment, and technology, and a bachelor's degree from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. And with 10110, what you're doing is looking at opportunities, sharing those opportunities with investors. So that's all about spreadsheets and rates of return and risk-adjusted rates of return. But in a city like Los Angeles, where you have so many diverse cultures and communities that come at things from different perspectives, from different axes. But if you kind of understand those, maybe those rates of return are really higher. Angel investors sometimes will look at the individual and say, well, I'm just going to bet on them as an individual, but the spreadsheet doesn't kind of pencil quite yet. But in your firm, in your experience, and in advising people outside of your firm, how does one span that and that sort of cultural divide between spreadsheets and rates of return, which we spend a lot of time here on at Anderson, and you did at Stern, and opportunities that happen when you've got kind of all of these different perspectives?
Sure. first of all, thanks again to UCLA Anderson for inviting me here. Very much appreciated. You know, I think that's a good question. Like as a venture investor, specifically a venture capitalist, you know, capitalism is in my title, right? You know, like that is what I do, and I'm a firm believer in it and all of its imperfections, right? But my goal is to generate the best return that I can, and for the role that I have as a VC, everything else comes secondary, or everything else is leading into that. Now, what that means to me is that in practice, things like taking an approach of a sort of a double bottom line or something like that is actually antithetical to how I go about doing my job in a lot of cases. And I've been a VC at 10110 for about almost 4 years, with other firms for another couple of years. And I do believe that there are my prime responsibility is to generate the best returns I can. I've been a black man in America a lot longer than I've been a VC, and I also recognize that I have a social responsibility to help and support people that didn't have the same resources as a lot of the people that I back and talk to every day. So really, to your question, is like, how do I bridge those two things? The things that I do for my job and the things that I know need to be done in society. Fortunately, I'm a strong believer that the changing demographics, and for that matter, Los Angeles demographics, are so favorable that if you take any kind of long-term view, the other thing about VC is we think about things in very long term. So thinking a decade out. If I'm thinking a decade out, it's hard for me to believe that if I look back in 2028 and look back at the top performing company in LA that was founded in 2018, hard for me to imagine that it does not have an executive team that's very diverse. It's hard for me to imagine that won't be a key tenet of how they're building out the company and how they think about growing the company. And it may be something that's doesn't fit the, oh, I graduated from Stanford, no offense, or like, and go and work for Google and went directly into tech. It may not fit that paradigm that people think of this is what a promising startup will look like. And I think what that comes from is from other people. I grew up in Inglewood Unified School District. So when I look at what success looks like and promising people, Stanford has nothing to do with what my list or my criteria is. And so it's a different perspective. So honestly, I think that, long story short, I think that both what I would love to see actually naturally over the long run is going to serve an advantage to where my own advantage as a VC in being able to invest in those entrepreneurs and grow great businesses, just because I think that diversity is going to be, if you focus on diversity, you are going to be able to attract the top talent because you're going to be looking at it through a different paradigm.
Okay, and we're going to come back to metrics of how you do that.
Sure.
But I want to turn to Jasmine Hill. So Jasmine is a researcher and consultant with the Annenberg Foundation, as well as a PhD student at Stanford University, and a candidate in sociology, actually. And she's been a National Poverty Fellow at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, a co-editor of Inequality in the 21st Century. And before graduate school, she worked as a nonprofit consultant on issues related to the school-to-prison pipeline and domestic violence. And just as a segue from where Austin grew up, you're working now in Inglewood and studying something that William pointed out in one of his slides, that blue area, one of those blue areas, that's Inglewood, right? And Inglewood has enormous amounts of construction, with the new stadium and all kinds of great things going on, but many people in Inglewood feel left behind. William's slide kind of says why. The level of human capital in the city of Inglewood is fairly low. And you've been studying how how that gets spanned between low human capital to high human capital and really entering the tech world. So maybe you can tell us something about that.
Sure. So I am a mixed methods researcher. So I study the longitudinal trends of workforce development in the United States and also here in LA County, but I also conduct ethnography, as you mentioned, in Inglewood and other parts of South LA particularly, because it's really important not just to think about what happens at the macro level, but how do people on the ground interpret it. So if we're saying that there's a tech boom, it matters if people in Inglewood and people in that map, people in the blue parts that we need to be concerned about, if they're even aware that this tech boom is happening. And the reality is that in Inglewood at one high school at present, 13% of students graduating from that high school have completed their A through G requirements, which means that they're eligible, just 13% are eligible to attend a Cal State or a University of California school at the point of graduation. So in a town where currently there's talks of not one but actually 2 stadiums coming, the things that we see in Inglewood are things that also, I know we'll talk about other cities, are huge issues that industry growth, particularly the tech industry, frankly, brings to cities as a challenge. And as Eb highlights the 88 cities of the county of Los Angeles, these are the types of issues that we have to grapple with. I think it's really important for us to think about the social, economic, and even political consequences of this type of growth. They're huge. We know from the benefits of the manufacturing industry to the Los Angeles economy in the 1980s, we know that industries have the power to infuse individuals with wages, with good lifespans. We also know that industries can disrupt communities in a significant way. And so the Annenberg Foundation, some of my brilliant colleagues there are working and thinking about how can we bring those who have the most to gain, so that is business leaders, how do we bring them to the table to make some commitments around how do we shape the future of the tech boom that's happening here in Los Angeles so we don't have some of these same inequitable outcomes. Los Angeles already is ranked in 150 metropolitan areas, the 7th most unequal already. And with the trajectory of, again, the tech boom, as it will continue to grow, we can imagine that if we continue along this same path, that would only continue. And so Annenberg Foundation is working with venture capitalists to think about how do we commit ourselves to making sure that equity, diversity, inclusion are core to how we're engineering the future of the LA tech boom. And how do we make sure that our social impact is a net positive for everyone as opposed to a negative?
And that's a great segue for the first question I have for all of the panel. So one of the reactions to the Amazon head tax in Seattle was Amazon and Microsoft are committing significant funds to help guide the evolution of tech and society in the city of Seattle, and that's not just there. Google is doing that in Toronto, and so maybe you all can discuss some of the risks of having the private sector get involved. We heard from Terry about privacy issues and some of these big companies that really have the potential to create big rewards. But also there are risks, and some of the risks may be associated with limits to local democracy, limits to local control of what happens to the various cities and communities. But the rewards could be, a very different trajectory than what we've seen in other cities. What do we kind of know, and what do we think about, and what do we need to know in order to understand this issue? So that's a really broad question, but I've got a really smart panel here, so let me just throw it open to you. Who would like to take it?
Yeah, so you mentioned Toronto. I think that's a really good example, right? So Sidewalk Labs, which is a subsidiary of Google that does their smart city stuff, it has a project in Toronto on the waterfront there. And they made an agreement with the city to kind of build this 12-acre waterfront community from the internet up, they call it. So, initially people were really excited about it. This was announced a couple years ago, probably before the sort of swell of privacy concerns that we've seen since the election in particular. So it sounds cool in theory. There's a lot of things that are great about it. It's like trash bins that know when they're full and automatically empty them, all kinds of green stuff around transportation. But there's also a huge data component. And Google, through Sidewalk Labs, has a plan to collect sort of all the data there. Think sort of Minority Report, where they're like scanning every person in the vicinity and they know everything you're doing. And from their perspective, they're saying this is going to help us build a better city, right? So we're going to pilot this here, and we're going to make the best city ever through this data. But the city, and it's partly the city's fault too, right? Like they initially agreed to let Sidewalk Labs in without really getting community input or anything else. And now there's been a big backlash against it because it's not clear, and it's still not clear to this day, what Google plans to do with all that data, and also who owns it, right? Should the city own it? This is a part of Toronto, or does Google own it, or are they splitting it in some way? So those are big issues. They're also equity issues, and when you look at a lot of these smart city kind of development things, you know, they're not in Inglewood, for instance. They're not in communities where they could be a lot of help. I mean, I think of Bird and things like that, where they're like, we're solving the last mile challenge, but most people are just riding those around Santa Monica, right? So. So anyway, these are important issues.
And I think there has to be some method of accountability. It can't just be private, it just can't be public, it has to be both. So I think opportunity zone funds are a very interesting concept and could potentially be a game changer. So if you're unfamiliar with opportunity zones, they have advantages for folks that have realized capital gains, and they can unlock trillions of dollars of investments into certain zones. I didn't mention this, but our innovation lab, which is a 35,000 square foot facility, has a makerspace, biotech lab, co-working. It sits a block and a half from an opportunity zone in Chatsworth, which is 30 miles north of here. And I feel that, you know, we've created new opportunities in that area, and I feel like there's a lot of potential for these blue zones to do that. But we need rules. Treasury still is trying to come out with rules and clarifications that would allow potentially venture capitalists to put this type of money to work.
Yeah, what kind of data do we need in order to get this accountability?
So one of the things that came up in the previous question is not only the responsibility for accountability and rules, but community participation. Mm-hmm. And so I think one potential opportunity for data analysis is how involved and how invested do community stakeholders feel in the process of co-creation and of visioning how this process moves forward. I also think, though, kind of also in our work with VCs, Annenberg is thinking a lot about how do we measure real tangible impact for VCs and for companies that say, I want to commit to doing more around equity, diversity, inclusion. Well, we're interested in measuring what does that tangibly mean in your portfolio? How do you measure over time the expansion of opportunities to those from low-income backgrounds? So not just thinking about race and gender, which of course are key and critical issues, but how do we think about a larger expansive category of the data that we need to collect? So data is critically important, but I think the other thing is that we have to begin to start to rethink our paradigms. So one of the data that we were presented today was the Human Capital Index, which is probably the best that we have to measure education. But the problem is that the growth of the industry is happening so quickly. The reality is that in the United States and in LA County, only about 25% of adults over 25 have a bachelor's degree. So this growth is happening at a rate that we can't keep up. And if we continue to only frame things in the paradigm of let's check off people who have bachelor's degrees, we won't make it. We have to think about changing human capital from being coupled with the definition of credentials to skills. Are we really interested in people having a piece of paper? Are we really interested in the skills that people possess? And so we're doing work right now to potentially develop platforms. We can talk to folks more about this later, but developing platforms that would facilitate the acknowledgement from the workforce on those type of data points. So skills as opposed to credentials that there's no way we could catch up to the need with how many folks are educated and have bachelor's degrees right now.
And I would say, in addition to skills, mindset. So I was just in Philadelphia at the Hispanic Chamber National Convention on a VC panel. And in the Latino community, one of the problems we face is that the new businesses that are being started aren't scaling. So a lot of them are and remain what we call lifestyle businesses, businesses that I as a VC would not invest in because the founders aren't thinking about how can I get to $1 billion. And it doesn't always have to be in high tech. When I was on that panel, I used the example of Casamigos, which is a tequila. Or even Ring, which is a doorbell, and that sold for $1 billion, or Dollar Shave Club, which is a razor company that sold for $1 billion. So a lot of it has to do with mindset as well.
Yeah, I feel like looking at larger companies of what like Google is doing, I know they're very forward thinking on paper, but they're like, to me, like a total like lagging indicator of what's really happening. So like, to Jasmine's point, I think recently they just announced that they're going to stop looking at bachelor or for bachelor's degrees, or requiring it. And to me, like, I've never had a conversation with a potential founder of where I'm going to invest in about like, what did you major in? Like that, like I don't care. It's just it's really about like what led them up to this point, and where and can I follow that trajectory and extrapolate where that's going to take them eventually, and particularly with this particular idea that they're presenting me with. So I think that's been happening on some level, and as that happens in these different environments, like where I am visiting places that probably a lot of VCs didn't show up in Inglewood. I'm in Inglewood all the time, and as I'm hearing these people's stories, and I can relate to the story, I understand the story, I know what place they play basketball, I know the types of people who mentored them and things like that, and to me that story will resonate in a way that it might not with even the guys who I work next to, who are great people, but just not coming from the same perspective, don't share the same experience. And so, in my view, I think that a lot of it does begin with the investors, because these are the people who are allocating capital to particular places to say, I like that idea enough and I believe in that idea enough to give it the spark. Whether it's going to succeed or not, it's going to be on you, but I'm in a position where I can give it a little push forward to see if it can generate enough momentum to grow into a massive business. And I think that just didn't happen in these communities. And wouldn't happen unless you have people that can understand and talk.
And that lowers the perception of risk.
And it lowers the perception of risk, yes. So, I mean, again, like, if to me, for example, if somebody says they went to Morehouse and somebody else says they went to Harvard, I view those things on par. Like I quite literally do. And so and it's because I understand what that means to somebody like who went there and the type of person that would go there and the type of person that would come up. To people now, the people that I work with, because they hear me rave about Morehouse all the time, but to other people it just may not resonate, and I wouldn't expect it to. There's plenty of experiences that I didn't have that somebody else could be very impressed with this person's credential or their experience, and I just didn't get it. I can't relate to it. I don't understand it, and thus don't value it. But I think as you have different people in positions from various perspectives that are in a position to allocate capital to ideas that resonate with them, you see lots of different things flourish.
Just another tangible example of that, because I think it's a really important opportunity. I think there are all these opportunities and there are all these people who are really have a ton of potential who are being overlooked right now. So you mentioned going down to Inglewood. I was at there's something called the LA Black Investors Club, right? And for the past year or two, they've been doing these black business pitch competitions in downtown Inglewood. Yeah. And the first one I went to, I think, was when you were a judge there. And there were a lot of good ideas there. Yeah. And there were probably, you might have been the only VC in the room. Maybe there was one other. There were very few people, if any, that looked like me. And I've subsequently went back 3 or 4 times, and it's been the same story. So, the main thing people have to do who are investors or sort of, leading in the business community is like, go out there and put in the effort to see what's out there. And I think there's so much that right now is overlooked. but you have to look for it. You have to look for those opportunities. And I think VC is one piece of it, but like Carmen was saying too, there's all these lifestyle businesses and amazing things that are happening that aren't getting just the basic kind of capital and financing that they need to grow, because they just don't have access to that stuff. So there's all these untapped opportunities across the entire county that we need to look at and have the will to go out there and learn.
So let's turn to a question about money. Government has a role to play here. Government has a big role to play in the trajectory of the city, and we talked about the budget of the county, and the county might be sort of the logical organizing governmental agency. But if you asked people, what are the problems in LA? They're probably not going to say what you all just said, which is having people look at other communities for opportunities to invest. They're going to say homelessness and poor roads and congestion, right? And those cost money. So how does government balance, or what is the argument for government balancing those demands on resources and the need to invest in a more shared prosperity from the tech boom? Any thoughts on that?
Capitalist here again. I don't think that it's going to be driven by government. I think that other efforts, I think it's going to be driven by private markets, and government can do things to support. Carmen touched on opportunity zones, total game changer in my view. Mm-hmm. The fact that people can allocate capital to a particular area and basically juice their returns because they don't have to pay capital gains taxes over a long period if they're investing for a longer period of time. If you guys haven't read or looked at opportunities, this is an economic conference, you probably have, but check them out. But ultimately, I mean, and I suspect that other people will disagree with me. Like, my reliance on government initiatives is next to zero in terms of like making this change. And maybe that's naive, but like when I think about how I want to be involved and where I want to be involved, like I appreciate everything that they're doing, but ultimately it's going to be individuals that are going to make that change.
But they can incentivize, and so yes. Here's two ways. There's AB 2041 that encourages UCs to invest in emerging managers. Why is that important? Because emerging managers typically look like us here. And so that, I think, would be a game changer to create an on-ramp for us to establish venture funds to make it feasible. So the opportunity's there, but it's just incredibly hard. Like, it would take me, 10 years to be eligible for an emerging manager program. That should be open to me right now, today. And there's ways to do that. Another way that government can act against venture capital as a whole is AB 2731, which is a surtax on carry. So this would effectively, potentially, increase the tax to 70% on carry. What does that do? That not only means that top-tier venture capitalists would probably move outside of California, but also would discourage new managers, again, like us, from starting funds because the incentives are not there. So in New York, this came up, and the government officials squashed it, and they said, we would only let this happen, this surtax, if all 5 states around us implemented the same thing, right? So that the industry would not move. So this bill will come up again next year, and it's something that government can do to continue to incentivize emerging managers, the next generation of VCs.
And that's in the state legislature,
yes.
Correct?
Right. Yeah, it's sitting in rules right now. Yeah, so it'll come back again.
And really quickly, where we know that government, to Austin's point, may not have much to do with by way of finding and supporting entrepreneurs. They do have tons to do with the pipeline. And so as we talk about human capital and the development of skills, it still is that our public schools, it was interesting that you framed like that the choice between homelessness and roads aren't actually like interconnected. Like a lot of these things are directly intertwined in a larger plan and discussion about how do we support the workforce moving forward, right? It does, I mean, homelessness represents a far extreme perhaps, but it is in many ways can be, amongst other factors, a result of a lack of human capital investment. So these things are intimately kind of intertwined, and it does impact the pipeline of how we get to a point where things are so unequal and look the way that they do right now.
Yeah, so I actually completely disagree with Austin. And I'm actually overstating. Jerry told us to kind of amp up. So I'm overstating it somewhat.
No.
Totally disagree.
He just unfriended me while we were
But I mean, so the part I do agree with is I think business is going to play a huge role in this. I think business has to be a partner in this project. And I also agree that, you know, and I understand both the dissatisfaction with government and the skepticism around government and kind of what government can do around these issues. Where I disagree is just sort of the scale and the potential of what government does and what it's capable of doing. So, for example, if you look at philanthropy, for instance, right? So if you combine individual philanthropy, so individual giving, it's like $200 and some billion a year. Foundation giving, total, 60-something billion a year, including Annenberg. I mean, there's a ton of great foundations. Annenberg is one of my favorite. But total, it's about 60-some billion a year for the whole country. And then corporate philanthropy is about $20 billion a year for the whole country. So you combine individual, corporate and foundation, and you've got about $400 billion a year. The government, if you combine state, local, and federal government, is about $7 trillion. That's how big the federal government budget is. So if you can improve what government's doing or change it in some way by about 10%, you can sort of surpass all philanthropy in the country combined. So the potential there is massive. If you look at something like our defense budget, which right now is 15 or 16% of our total budget, you bring that down by 1% from 15 to 14, let's say, you can have a chunk of money there, $60, $70 billion, which would be the entire philanthropic sector, and you could invest it in workforce development, you could invest it in these communities that right now don't have access to capital. You could give people money. I mean, there's a whole thing around like, oh, you know, there's thousands and thousands, there's about 70,000 nonprofits in LA. A lot of them are looking at these poor communities and like, how can we help them? What can we do? And they're spending tons of money in this nonprofit sector. You could just give people a lot of that money. Maybe one of the issues with poorer communities, they don't have any money there. And they need money. You know, there's all these historical things that have happened over decades and centuries that have restricted them from having money and building wealth. LA, as Jasmine hinted at, it's one of the most unequal places in the country. There was a study that UCLA did in 2016 that said the average or the median Latino or Black family in Los Angeles has 1/100th the family wealth of the average white family. Mm-hmm. That's insane. That was a UCLA study. So anyway, I'm getting off track here, but there's a lot you can do, and I think government has to play a huge role just because in terms of money, it's such a massive
And maybe
play.
You don't give them money directly, but you can, like, so Portland, for example, when I went to Berkeley for my MBA, and when I was graduating, I looked at different opportunities, and one was in Portland because the city had set aside a pool of capital, $1 million to invest in diverse founders and women, right? And a small pool of capital, but still meaningful. And what ended up happening is a venture capitalist kind of took that as part of their fund and still said, I will allocate to this demographic. So that's one way of like giving people money, but in a different,
So we're
method.
We're just getting started, and it's 11:15. So you all have to promise me that you'll come back and we can continue the conversation. But this has really been informative and eye-opening of things that need to be done, but also pathways for them to be done. So thank you to each and every one of you for coming over to UCLA for the first time, or not for the last time.
I've been here before.
And we definitely want to welcome you back to one of our future programs to continue this discussion. And please join me in thanking our panel.